The Lotus Garden. Our tour bus had come down from the highway and turned left. Then it turned right, and left again. We finally came to the town of Modesto. The bus turned onto a country road. After several wrong turns, we saw a little wooden plate, Lotus Garden, on the side of a dirt road. This was the place, which could not be found on the map, but had allured us all the way. It was the biggest Chinese lotus garden on the west coast. The bus drove under branches that brushed against the top of the bus and stopped at a sign, which said, "For pedestrians only." The afternoon was getting late. We got out. The black dirt path was covered with yellow leaves, but the air was still hot and humid like summer. We turned the corner. There was a field of lotus leaves. They curved around and stretched forward. Among the green lotus leaves there were several white blooms. It made me homesick for the lotus garden in Taipei, the summer evening walks along the curving lotus ponds. We took pictures and walked along the field. A cooling breeze rose from the leaves and made ripples. Not far ahead was a wooden kiosk in the middle of the water, connected by a wooden pathway from the shore. The professor who was taking care of the Lotus research project was supposed to meet us. Now he was nowhere to be found. We sat down on the bench inside the kiosk, surrounded by water. We could see the reflection of the sky and the clouds. Several pairs of ducks were swimming and dipping their heads into the clear water. It was even quieter here than the lotus field we just passed. About half an hour later, a man in sandals and a coolie hat came. He was Professor Wang. He looked like a hermit. He smiled and said that he had been waiting for us since noon. When we didn't show up, he went back to his living quarters and took a nap. The professor explained to us how the lotus has a history of several thousand years and has its significance from Buddhism. About 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, it became the favorite flower of the Chinese royalty and a subject of poetry and painting. Professor Huang was invited from the mainland, and he conducted pollen hybridization of various types of lotus flowers, which he had grown from the seeds he brought with him from China. He had come up now with more than 100 new hybrids, a feat anyone could be proud of. He did the work all by himself, and he said July is the best month to see the lotus blooms in all colors and shapes. Around 10 in the morning is the time the bloom is at its fullest. He hoped that we would come back again at that time. He then took us to a lotus field of withering stems and dying leaves. It had a beauty of its own. He showed us little baby lotus roots coming through the mud beneath the dying plants. Not far away was the nursery where little cultivated lotus plants were kept in small containers of water for people to bring home. He said it's the wish of the owners that the beautiful plant, the ancient flower of China, which comes from a long way from the other side of the ocean, can grow in our immigrant homes and be cherished. Around the nursery there were yellow water lilies and purple hyacinth in the pond. The professor said the yellow ones were native and the oldest on this continent. We continued walking into the wooded area. Apple trees and other fruit trees were growing close together, their branches intertwined. Fallen apples were all over the ground. Someone asked about the owners. Professor Huang said they were overseas students that came from Taiwan. The mistress of the garden was even from the same middle school that I went to. About 20 years ago, she and her husband bought 30-some acres of this fruit orchard, and they brought water from a nearby river and started the lotus ponds. They had wanted to build a Chinese garden with all the beauty and mystery of the East, rock mountains, streams, pagodas, and pavilions in this foreign land, their new adopted home. They worked day and night to make their dream come true. Now the mistress, alone in Modesto, managed 2 restaurants to keep the garden open to the public without charge. We asked why she was in Modesto and where her husband was. The professor was silent and kept walking. We followed him and came to a faded wooden bridge. Dense vines were growing on the sides of the bridge, and we came to a little temple. In it was the statue of the merciful Guan Yin. There was a young couple kneeling inside, praying. Someone again asked about the owner of the garden. The professor said wistfully that he had been killed in an accident 3 years ago. This temple was built in memory of him. Everyone's steps hesitated. I suddenly remembered my newly published poetry anthology. On the cover was the picture of a lotus my mother painted. The book was in memory of my mother. She had also died from an accident the year before. I wanted to give a copy of the poetry book to the mistress of the garden. I ran to the bus and took a copy from my bag and came down. I walked quickly and turned the corner to meet with my tour companions and the professor. I couldn't see them or the temple, but in front of me was a vast lotus field. Far away on a small hill was a thatched kiosk. It didn't look like the kiosk we were at before. The lotus field stretched forward and was making quiet music with the breeze. The sun was beginning to set, and the western sky had turned golden. I looked in awe at what was strange and stunning. Then I saw a lone gray egret sauntering leisurely among the lotus leaves, its elegant neck floating gracefully over the green waves. Then it disappeared. I saw before me a white lotus in full bloom. One of its petals opened towards me, revealing its yellow pistil inside. The tips of its petals were red and transparent in the setting sun. It looked so familiar, and I looked at the cover of my book. It looked exactly like the lotus in my mother's painting. All of a sudden, more than a year of sorrow of missing my mother turned to gratitude. My mother's late brush had left beauty to the world, and the owner of the garden had left behind the beauty of the garden for people who came to see. I stood there for a long time, marveling at the bloom in front of me. I felt resurrected. Then I walked back, following the same route I came from. Before I turned the corner, I looked back. The lone lotus above the green leaves shone gloriously against the dimming evening sky. I saw my friends were talking with the professor in front of the temple. I joined them, and I gave the little book to Professor Huang to give it to my schoolmate, the mistress of the garden. She would understand.